Let's get some analysis of where the political situation is at. David Gazard, DPG Advisory Director and former Liberal advisor, and Ben Oquist, Executive Director of the Australia Institute, former Greens advisor. David, first to you. Let's start with lions and Tasmania more broadly. I would say my assessment at the moment is that it's probably one of the stronger places for the government right now.
Yes, I think the government feels reasonably confident in campaigning and succeeding in Lions. What struck me in watching that package that had been put together was how, and we've seen it in the course of the new year, and the way that people are starting to engage more around the handling of COVID, which of course has been problematic for all governments around the world, including Australia's, and no government has done everything perfectly, but the Australian government has certainly come out and probably succeeded in places like vax rates and the rate of death and so on, even though there's a high level of frustration with the way things have gone after 2 years. And you can understand that. I got caught in that. Christmas was changed for us this year, and I'm talking to you from home because I'm a close contact, so I can't go to work today. So we're all frustrated with that. We're all sick of it. But we're starting to see things move now into more than just a referendum on the handling of COVID, but a choice between the parties. And it's one thing to be frustrated with the government, and you'd probably be frustrated with the governments right around the world, depending on where you live. But you've got to make your mind up on, would Labor have been able to handle this pandemic better than the government? And I think that's a very live question. And then I'd add on top of that the other things that come with a government that, has to do its day job and help manage the economy, help manage security. So you sort of feel for this government in that it's almost been, or there's almost been a requirement that there be two governments, one that's handled a major global crisis and the other that just gets on and does its day job. So I think people are going to be confronting that in Lions and looking to choose between the parties and the leaders.
Ben Oquist, that's a fair assessment, I think, from David. The question is, though, and this is something we've seen, that David's seen, you've seen, and I've seen over many years. Sometimes the electorate switched off. They've made a judgment. They're not listening anymore. That's the risk for Scott Morrison at the moment.
It is. Obviously the election's a long way to go, but on the current polls, the government's toast, isn't it? At 56-44, according to Newspoll. We've got similar polling. We polled Lions in December. It had Labor ahead 52.8, but they'd want to be ahead. That's a Labor-held seat. They need to hold that. They need to win Bass or Braddon. I think Tasmania is more interesting and important than people give credit for. Lots of tension on Queensland, but they're three must-win seats for Labor, you'd think, holding Lions and winning Bass and Braddon, if they're going to win the necessary 7 or 8 seats to get majority government. It is interesting, though, this incumbency issue. Clearly, Scott Morrison was, literal about it yesterday, saying this is not a referendum on me, it's a choice between me and Albanese. And there's been that big shift, hasn't there? Early on the pandemic, we've talked a lot about how incumbency was a positive for a government, by and large, Donald Trump notwithstanding, and that governments were rewarded because the electorate really had to back their government in a crisis. You're not seeing that anymore, and there's been that big shift. Scott Morrison wants to make this election about Anthony Albanese. Anthony Albanese wants to make this election about Scott Morrison, and whoever, in a sense, wins that debate will probably win the election. But Scott Morrison is starting from a long way behind at this stage.
David, if you look back to your former boss, John Howard, and that sort of period, 4 terms over a decade, compared to now, the coalition seeking a 4th term, Prime Minister's been in office over 3 years. He's overtaken all of the more recent PMs like Turnbull, Abbott, Rudd, Gillard. So he's the longest serving of this phase. But 3 years today is the equivalent of a lot longer in the days of Mr. Howard, because the news cycle and the visibility is greater. Do Do you agree with that? Is it a trickier proposition to go long and have longevity today?
The cycle, I think, tends to be more abrupt. Issues are truncated and collapse together, and the swings are greater. I think there's no doubt that it's more difficult to govern these days in a world of social media. The news cycle is much shorter, and the intrusion into politicians' lives and the expectations are much higher. The one thing I would say, after working in and around politics for 30 years and working for John Howard through some election campaigns, was that in nearly every campaign that I've worked, starting with John Howard, the coalition has started from well behind. And it was certainly Howard's view that if you started at 52-48, you could make that up over the course of a 5-week campaign. I do think this campaign is going to be unique because it is an uncertain world. There's no one that could possibly take exception to that. We've dealt with a global pandemic that has benefited the incumbent, and I think Labor have deliberately tried to focus on Scott Morrison's management of the pandemic so they can scab lift on various things that have gone wrong. But of course, that doesn't mean you can manage those issues any better than the current government could. And I'm sure the government will start comparing how it's done with the rest of the world, and people will start going, well, perhaps we haven't had it so bad here, even though it's been a very difficult and frustrating time for us. And the problem, I think, that Labor might confront is that in taking a small target and just seeking to focus on scab lifting on problems, Labor won't have built its own credentials and won't have made the case about why voters should change. So there's a danger in just hammering away on all the negatives and not offering a suitable alternative on your own. So Anthony Albanese will have to find that out. Yeah.
Indeed. Now, that's definitely a risk, but Ben, I guess the other challenge for Mr. Morrison at this time is almost a flip of the 2019 experience, where Bill Shorten was pulled in all sorts of directions and really found it a difficult proposition with, from the left and the right. To me, this time with senators, anti-vax mandate senators pulling in one direction, small L Liberals in another, and the Teal independents, and the New South Wales government as well, for example. The PM just has a lot of awkward things he's trying to manage, as well as a re-election campaign.
Yeah, part of it comes with being a 9-year-old government, and some of these things build up over time, and often the divisions build up over time. I mean, we've got the ridiculous situation with the Liberals in New South Wales at the moment, when all these seats haven't even been pre-selected. Like Hughes and Dobell and Bennelong and Parramatta and Warringah, key seats. And I think New South Wales is the key state in this election. Both sides are seeking to win seats off each other, and yet the Liberals are so divided they can't get those seats pre-selected. We're weeks from an election campaign. And then there's Matt Keane, who didn't miss this week. I thought his assault on the Prime Minister was probably the most important thing that happened this week, because it wasn't just on the Prime Minister and the lack of support from the government for New South Wales right now. It was kind of an assault on what the government's economic agenda or promises might be coming up. Scott Morrison, after these years in power, is very well known. David Gazard is right. Anthony Albanese is less well known, and the risk is that he's not well known enough. But I think his problem is he's not well known enough. Scott Morrison is too well known, and there are solutions for Anthony Albanese on that. He is going to need to put more flesh on the bone, more policies, not overlearn the mistakes from the 2019 election campaign, where Bill Shorten was seen to have too big an agenda. He needs to have some, but he's got space to do it now.
Ben, David, great to chat. See you next week.